Hey guys, welcome back. We are moving on with our presentation on the cultural geography of the Middle East. This one is specifically focused on the history of some of the groups that have existed in this region. So let's get into it. We're going to start with Mesopotamia. Now, you guys have done Mesopotamia before in elementary school. We're going to hit it again. Mesopotamia is the place. It means land between two rivers. The two rivers specifically are the Tigris and the Euphrates. That was a question from last week's work, so you hopefully remember that. The present day country that the Tigris and the Euphrates are located in is the country of Iraq. At the time of Mesopotamia, it was referred to as the Fertile Crescent. Because it was between these two rivers, the soil there was incredibly fertile and great for farming. Mesopotamia is referred to as a culture hearth. That means it is the center point for a plethora of cultures that then develop and spread outward from it. So think of throwing a rock into a pond. The ripple effect as Mesopotamia influences cultures around it, and that continues to expand. Master farmers grew crops year-round using irrigation canals. So even though this was so long ago, they had already figured out how to irrigate crops. They established 12 different cities with a code of law, and they developed a written language. That written language is cuneiform, which if you look at cuneiform, it's essentially a series of like crescents and half moons. But it is our first example in the history of civilizations of written language. And the people who lived there were called Sumerians. The next group we're going to talk about are the Egyptians. The Egyptians, obviously, built along the Nile River in, guess what, Egypt. The Nile is an incredibly important river. We talked about in last week's lecture videos that the three freshwater rivers in the region, the Tigris and Euphrates that we talked about on the last slide, and the Nile, are extremely important because they're really the biggest source of fresh water for the surrounding areas. So the Egyptians specifically built along the Nile because it provided so much fresh water for farming as well as for trade and transportation. Annual floods of the Nile left rich soil that was good for farming. In dry seasons, they used irrigation to water crops. So again, this is another civilization that had figured out the irrigation piece to keeping crops alive. And farmers could grow 2 crops per year. Okay, so it wasn't just you plant in the spring, you harvest in the fall, and you're done. They had developed a system where they could actually grow 2 separate crops throughout the year. These guys also had a form of written language called hieroglyphics. You guys may be familiar with hieroglyphics. They are pictures, a series of picture writing. And the Egyptians also developed a 365-day calendar. That is still the original calendar that our current 365-day calendar is built on. They built pyramids as tombs for their rulers. Okay, so of the things on this slide that I need you to remember, know that they're built along the Nile and why. Know what hieroglyphics are and what they were used for. Know that the Egyptians are the ones that developed the original calendar that our current calendar is based on. And obviously pyramids and Egyptians tend to go hand in hand, so I assume you'll remember that one. The next group we're going to talk about are the Phoenicians. If this word sounds familiar to you, it's probably because of this word. When we talk about phonics, it comes from the civilization of the Phoenicians because the Phoenicians were the first people who developed an alphabet where letters stood for sounds. Previously, as we saw with the Egyptians, they had pictures that stood for words. similar combinations of symbols that we saw with cuneiform. But the Phoenicians are the first group where they actually had individual letters, and those individual letters had their own sound. Okay, so our present day alphabet is based on something that the Phoenicians created, which is why when we talk about phonics, which are the building blocks of words, right, how we learn to read, that's why that word comes from the word Phoenician. They developed along the eastern Mediterranean coast, and their original alphabet is the basis for many alphabets used in the Western world today, including the English one. All right, the next group we're going to talk about are the Persians. The Persians came about in the 500s BC. Remember, we talked about the Iranians and how the Iranians were also, or Iran is also called Persia. So the Persian Empire is where present-day Iran is today. It was a huge empire that spread from the Nile River in the west to the Aegean Sea. The Aegean Sea is on the east side of Greece, between Greece and Turkey, all the way to the Amu Darya in the Central Asia to the east. Amu Darya is a lake, it's a river. It's a river. So they originally, or at their height, had this ginormous empire, which ruled a lot of the region. The biggest piece of the Persian Empire that I want you to remember are what they did with irrigation. Now, we talked about how both the Egyptians and the Sumerians in Mesopotamia had figured out irrigation. Well, but think about irrigation in these terms. We've got canals, right? Maybe some of you even have canals that border your backyard. Those canals specifically are for irrigation. But if you think about the Middle East, those irrigation canals are open, right? They're open to the air. They're open to the heat and the sun. And what happens to water in heat and sun? Well, it evaporates. And so the water getting from the source, whether it's a river up in the mountains or a lake, to where they actually need to farm, could be, in some cases, very long distances. And so digging these open air canals, the water that leaves the original source is not the same amount of water that makes it all the way to where they needed it to water their crops. And so the Persians came up with this really cool system called qanats. What a qanat is it's essentially an underground river or underground canal that carries water from mountains across the deserts to farmlands. These qanats are still in operation. Some of them hundreds or even thousands of years old. If we were together, we would actually watch a short documentary on qanats. But the fact that they still exist speaks to the engineering marvels that the Persians were able to accomplish, 2,500 years ago, specifically to prevent the evaporation of water. Because it was such a hot, such a dry climate, they needed every drop they could spare. And so coming up with this engineering solution is fairly impressive, especially when we consider how long ago it was. This is well before modern day technology, well before machinery. These qanats are channels underneath the ground that people can walk in. And some of them are miles and miles long. They were all dug by hand. Pretty impressive. All right, the next group we're going to talk about, actually the last group we're going to talk about, are the Mongols. Now, we talked about the Mongols already in our Russia unit. That is because the Mongols were quite a prolific people. And they had some fairly extensive conquests. And so in the same way that the Mongols kind of took over and conquered a lot of Russia, They also took over and conquered a lot of the Middle East. So the things I want you to know about the Mongols for this unit, they were nomads. Okay, nomads travel across the land, seeking grasslands for their herds. The Mongols were a group of nomads who invaded this land. Now, because they were nomadic, the idea of conquering more and more land really wasn't that big of a deal to them because they were moving anyway. It's not like they had this base back in Mongolia and they had to send, troops or armies out thousands and thousands of miles to the Middle East or to Russia in order to conquer these lands. They were moving around already. Okay, so the further and further they went, the more they conquered. In the late 1100s, the famous Mongol leader you've probably heard of him, Genghis Khan, united the nomadic Mongol tribes living in North China. In the late 1200s, they invaded Central Asia, and they establishing this ginormous empire. We're going to look at a map of their empire on the next slide. The Mongols killed tens of thousands of people in order to gain control. They were known as being very, very ruthless. But despite their brutality, they also brought improvements with them, including paper money and safe trade routes. Now, considering that they were nomadic, it makes sense that they had established paper money. Carrying around heavy coins would have been a lot of extra weight that a nomadic tribe wouldn't want to have to handle. And so this paper money idea seemed made a lot more sense, a lot more efficient. And safer trade routes. They were always on the move. They wanted to be able to travel safely. So both of these are because they were nomadic already. This last slide is a map of the height of the Mongol Empire, which was 1294. Now you'll see you've got Russia up here, right? Moscow. We talked before about the Muscovites, who with Ivan the Great was the one who united the Muscovites and overthrew the Mongols, right? But you also get down here. This is present-day Iraq. Over here is present-day Iran. This right here is Afghanistan. This is Pakistan. Okay, so a lot of this area that we talk about as the Middle East was at one point in time actually ruled by the Mongols. Now, when we think of Mongols, we think of Mongolia, which is actually over here. So pretty vast distance, all the way down into China, all the way up into Russia, East and West Russia, and then all the way down into the Middle East as well. And that is it for our discussion about history. Again, please make sure you are compiling notes in the graphic organizer that's provided in Canvas. You do have to upload those notes for your assignment this week. But it should also be known that these three presentations, so the last one on people, this one on history, and then the next one on religion, those three presentations and then your assignment to fill out the graphic organizer for the notes for these three presentations that's it for you guys for this week. Okay, so make sure you listen to the next presentation, make sure you take notes on all three, and upload those notes to Canvas. And I will see you guys next time.